Good evening and welcome to Top Story. Well, BC Hydro says the proposed hydroelectric power project known as Site C on the Peace River is in the best interest of British Columbians. It would provide critical power to liquefied natural gas plants and help fuel the provincial economy. But environmental groups like the Outdoor Recreation Council say the project would have detrimental effects on the environment, such as loss of key wintering wildlife habitat. To discuss the issue, we are joined in studio by Mark Angelo, Chair of the Outdoor Recreation River Council. Thank you for coming. Welcome.
Good to be here, Randy.
And Dave Conway is on the telephone from Prince George tonight. Thank you for joining us, Dave Conway from BC Hydro.
My pleasure.
So let's start with you. Site C Dam has been in the news for years now, since the 1960s. It's always been controversial because of what it would do to the environment and flooding the surrounding land on either side of the Peace. Why is it still such an important project for BC Hydro?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that British Columbia has benefited immensely from BC Hydro's investment in hydroelectricity over the decades. Today we have an electricity supply in BC that's more than 90% clean, and we remain with some of the lowest rates among all jurisdictions in North America. Site C would continue to add to that heritage supply. It's required to help meet future electricity needs of the province. BC Hydro's current forecast shows electricity demand increasing by approximately 40% over the next 20 years, and that's driven by a projected population increase of more than 1 million residents and economic expansion.
Okay. Before we get into the electrical response, or from the the power response from you, I do want to ask you, Mark, why did you decide today that the Peace was endangered? This was a compilation of how many people that...
The Endangered Rivers list, the development of that here in British Columbia, is the most comprehensive list of its kind anywhere in North America. We heard from a huge segment of British Columbians, and this year more than ever, one river, the Peace, literally dominated the process, and I think that reflects just how passionate people in that region are. But the reasons why the Peace is at the top of this year's list, one relates to environmental impacts. The environmental impacts are significant impacts to fish, significant impacts to wildlife. From a First Nations perspective, many sacred sites will be lost, will be covered with water. The best agricultural land we have, the only Class 1 agricultural land we have, north of Quesnel, will be lost. So the environmental impacts and cultural impacts are very significant. In addition to that, we have to be sensitive to the opposition that exists to this dam in the region. The opposition is so widespread and so passionate amongst both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. I think that's something in this province, in this country, we have to respect. All affected First Nations are opposed. And then on top of that, there's the whole question of need, which also right now is very questionable, and I'd love to get into that, and we will in a few minutes. But for all those reasons, that's why the Peace is BC's most endangered river.
I want you to respond to that, Dave, if you would, especially about, I mean, you are the community relations manager up there for BC Hydro. You live in Prince George. You visited these communities and these Native communities as well. It's a tough proposition to convince most people to do, isn't it? You've been doing this since, what, 2004?
Well, I've been involved certainly with the project when we started looking at its feasibility in 2004. And once we entered stage 2 in December 2007, I've been pretty much involved with the project full-time. I should clarify that my role is primarily with stakeholder community, property owners, and local regional government. Mm-hmm. We have a parallel but separate consultation process with First Nations, and I'm not directly involved in that process. So yes, I've been quite involved. I've been involved in over 500, we've held over 550 meetings since December 2007. I certainly have been involved in a large portion of those meetings. And there is passion, as Mark said, from people who are opposed to the project. I think what often gets overlooked is we see many people who also support the project and also who are looking for information. And those are people who generally don't seem to come out to meetings, and they don't come out to write letters, but they will encounter you or talk to you at the office or at an open house. So there's mixed feelings about the project within the region.
Dave, when does it become okay, though, to realize that a hydroelectric power project is more important, for example, than, say, a certain species of fish or native plant or arable land? Is there something that you have to weigh there as well, or is your job just to try and create more power, and you leave that up to the environmental groups and the provincial and federal governments?
Well, like any large infrastructure projects, we know that this one will have effects. And there's been substantial work that we've undertaken to date, numerous years of work since 2007, fish, wildlife, socioeconomic studies, and we feel that largely the effects can generally be some avoided or mitigated through careful project planning, comprehensive mitigation programs, and ongoing monitoring through construction and operations. And you can deal with a lot of this.
Okay. Gentlemen, we are going to take a quick break. When we come back, I do want to talk about the power part of it, because that is a very important part here in BC. How are we going to get power now and into the future, especially for those LNG plants? And we're also going to hear from the Premier, Christy Clarke, about how she says Site C is an absolute necessity, and John Horgan, the energy critic for the NDP, who says, hold on a second, we're not ready to say yes to Site C. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Stay with us with our conversation with Mark Angelo and Dave Conway. Welcome back to Top Story. I'm Randy Neal. We're continuing our conversation about the controversial Peace River Site C power project. We're joined in studio by Mark Angelo, chair of the Outdoor Recreation River Council, and on the telephone from Prince George by Dave Conway. He's the Site C community spokesperson for BC Hydro. Now, earlier I mentioned before the break that Premier Christy Clarke is very pro Site C. She said it's an absolute necessity for our 5 LNG plants that are proposed in northern BC. Here's what she had to say a couple weeks ago, and then what our energy critic, NDP John Horgan, had to say about Site C.
Are, though, I think, going to have to build Site C. You can't power up these huge facilities without more power. So BC Hydro is going to have to build Site C. We're in favor of making that happen.
Site C. I've had different positions on Site C over the years. I often get ribbed by the journalists about that. But right now, we don't need the energy. We have 5,000 gigawatt hours more than we need because of failed BC Liberal energy policies. It would be idiocy to spend another $10 billion on Site C now to have more energy than we can use conceivably for industrial development or for residential development.
All right, Mark Angelo, I'm assuming you agree more so with John Horgan there, the energy critic. We have an abundance of power and electricity right now. We don't need more.
I do. Going back to Dave's point, I have a great respect for how we benefited from BC Hydro over the years. But this particular project does not fit into that mode. And yes, I do agree with the statement that the opposition critic made. Looking at BC Hydro's own forecast, we are in surplus territory, significant surplus territory for quite a few years to come. At least 5,000 gigawatts, in 2013, 5,500 gigawatt hours in 2015. So we certainly do not need the power domestically. And looking at LNG, with all due respect, I totally disagree with the comment that the Premier made in that LNG, if we were to build Site C, first of all, LNG may not even happen, in that the premium for LNG 5 years from now will be a lot less than it is today. So economically, LNG still may not happen because of that. It may not make the economic sense a few years from now that it does today.
Especially if there's an NDP government.
But if LNG were ever to go, to build Site C just to power an LNG plant, in our view, that represents a totally excessive and inappropriate economic and environmental subsidy to the industry. So that's certainly something we would oppose.
Dave Conway from BC Hydro, is there an abundance of energy right now? We don't need any more for the foreseeable future, including for the LNG plants?
Well, at the present time, there's a surplus of energy. But the integrated resource plan that we do, which is our long-term look, is a 20-year forecast. And when you look down the road 20 years, and large hydro projects like this are very complex. They require long lead times to plan, design, and complete the rigorous environmental assessment process. So we're about halfway right now, and what we've been told by the regulators is a 3-year process. We would expect from the regulators to have a decision sometime in late 2014, and then there's still 7 years to construct if we receive the certification to move forward with the project. So you're not looking at any energy online until 2021-22. So this project would provide not just the energy, but firm capacity, instantaneous capacity, which is of value. And the load forecast shows that the energy and the capacity would be needed around the time that this project would come online. In addition, the load forecast that we presently have, which was filed with our business case in our environmental assessment statement, shows that we aren't taking into account in this forecast any liquid natural gas load. So it doesn't include that. So if it did come online, it would alter what we see in this forecast document as surplus.
What will this do to the Peace, Mark? There's already 2 hydroelectric dams on the Peace River in BC.
Impacts from dams on rivers tend to be cumulative. There are already 2 dams, so this would add a whole bundle of new impacts. Secondly, it would flood the last free-flowing stretch of what is an incredibly beautiful and important river. That's why people are so passionate about it. They feel enough sacrifices have been made on the Peace. Also, once again, coming back to the LNG argument, to me, I think this would be such an unfortunate subsidy, an inappropriate subsidy if we were to build this just to fund a plant or just to provide power for an LNG plant. It's interesting when you think about if the plants are ever built, and I'm not convinced they will be, but if they're ever built, all of the gas that's delivered to port in, let's say, Kitimat, all of that's going to be burned, whether it be all in Asia or whether it be 1 or 2% here to power a plant and the rest sent to Asia and burned. Either way, it's all going to be burned. But if we decide to power those plants electrically, then on top of that global greenhouse gas footprint, which is going to be the same either way, on top of that, you're also going to get the very substantial impacts associated with the building of the dam. So if you were to do a true full cost accounting analysis of the options, building Site C, even from that perspective, doesn't make sense. So I think it's to the betterment of British Columbia environmentally, culturally, socially, on all fronts to say, hey, now is not the time to think about Site C. It's way too early.
Dave, you get the final response to that tonight.
Certainly. Well, I'll start with the comment related to the third facility on the Peace River. So this facility would be located 83 kilometers downstream from the Peace Canyon Dam, which is a dam about the same size as we're suggesting this one, and an additional 20 kilometers upstream is the W.A.C. Bennett Dam with the Williston Reservoir. This dam, and we agree, there are potential effects with this project. Those effects, in fact, are lessened because of the facilities that are upstream, particularly the W.A.C. Dam and the Williston Reservoir. There's 2 to 3 years worth of water storage in that facility. And what you're doing is you're optimizing the resource that is already there. You lessen the impact. So the flooding that would occur for this structure that would create the reservoir is there for head on the turbine. But the reservoir is 1/20th the size of the Williston Reservoir because you don't have to build for water storage, but you get 1/3 of the energy. And that capacity, that energy, allows us to add intermittent resources to the system that are considered green with relatively few substantive impacts as a result. So that's one of the primary benefits. At the end of the day, when if the electricity comes out of this facility and is produced, that 1,100 megawatts of capacity and 5,100 gigawatt hours of energy, it's there for all British Columbians to use. It goes onto the grid and doesn't go to one particular source. It will be used by residential customers, it'll be used by commercial customers, and it'll be used by industrial customers, just as it is now. And that's about a third. We all benefit from that in the end.
All right. Dave Conway from BC Hydro, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And I did promise you, Mark, to give you the final word to talk about what else this report came out with today. It wasn't just the Peace River that's endangered, but there are other rivers that you really want to bring to the forefront of people's minds because you think it's so important.
Well, just quickly, the Endangered Rivers list, I think it does a lot to create a greater awareness about the threats that confront rivers, and it gives profile to major river issues like the Peace. But other issues on that list are the Fraser, most notably the heart of the Fraser, the stretch from Hope to Mission, one of the most productive stretches of river on Earth, but also a section of river that's under great development pressure. It's a stretch of river that's in great need of a plan, a management plan, a collaborative plan, if we are to protect those values. The other one is the Elk in the southeastern part of the province near Fernie. A river that's very much threatened with pollution, runoff, selenium actually from the number of coal mines there. That's a grave concern. So those are the three issues that top the list this year.
And you said we need to start planning our rivers and actually making a management plan and a provincial plan.
We do, and you know, while we need mechanisms to strengthen how we protect rivers, unfortunately we're going the other way in that we're seeing the weakening of federal legislation. If I were to say provincially, what could we do? The next government will have a chance to modernize the Water Act, which is a century old. That would go a long way in terms of protecting rivers. So I think we have to look at improving the mechanisms we have to protect rivers as opposed to weakening them.
All right, Mark Angelo, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Great to be here, Randy.
We really appreciate it.